I am going to tell you about the Fields plugin, and I'm doing a kind of a deep dive in it. Um, so, who am I? My name is Soren. I'm from Denmark. I have been a Java developer since the year 2000 and a Groovy developer since 2009. I am part of the OCI team, and I founded GreatConf. So next time you need a fix for your Groovy and Grails needs, it's GreatConf in India in January, GreatConf in Europe in the end of May, and GreatConf in Minneapolis in the end of July. And before that, the Screech in the end of March in Spain. And I'm a nerd, and I like it. I said work for object computing. You've seen probably many slides for them, so we're just going to really skip past them. We are hiring. The session agenda, more interesting. So what is the Fields plugin, and why would we want to use it? So, and when we got those things down, start looking at what happens if you just use it when it's default, not modifying any templates or nothing, but just use it as default. And then we'll dive into custom rendering, how the template folders are laid out, and then the deep dive will be a switch from the regular Grails to the styling with Bootstrap. So it will look like what, if you go to getbootstrap.com, you can see what it will look like, and I will go there eventually. And then we'll have time for a Q&A, or you can just skip the Q&A and you can ask questions during the talk. That's probably easier. So what is the Fields plugin? Well, there was a plugin previously called, and now the name skips my mind. It was made by a guy from Britain. Yeah, Robert. No, that was not. It wasn't Robert Fletcher. And not him. No. Well, it doesn't matter. But Robert Fletcher did this, inspired by another plugin that had some of the same ideas. So the idea is that you customize the rendering of input fields and display in a central folder, and then when you change something in these little snippet templates, everything changes across your entire application, and it does that on the basis of the bean name and the property name and the type and stuff like that. So it's very fine-grained, and it allows you to modify either a single field in a single bean or have a generalized string render for string input fields, for example. But we'll get back to that in a little bit. So it aims to use good defaults for fields as it is now. So it will output something that goes well with the Grails scaffolding templates. But it makes it very easy to override these field renderings. So you don't have to copy and paste markup layout information throughout the application. So you can also use indexes. So if you have a sub property in a sub element, it will support that as well. And so it will also allow you to package if you have another plugin, you can package fields that go with that plugin. The example is the JotaTime plugin has fields to support JotaTime. So when you have JotaTime and fields plugin, it will automatically pick up the fields that are defined in Jota. And so why use it? Well, first reason I could think of was it's already there. It's in the it's a dependency for the scaffolding plugin, and you can modify scaffolded views without actually having the scaffolded views in your project. You can just modify the templates for the fields plugin, and the scaffolded views that come from the scaffolded plugin will automatically render with those templates. It definitely helps keeping your GSP files dry, so don't repeat yourself. And it also gives you a common place to define those widgets and display widgets. So before we get started, let's just set the stage. This is a little bit small, but I hope you can see it. It's just a class that I've made a small project. It's 2 classes based on my previous talk to the plugin. So we have writers and we have a team. And we're going to focus on the writer class because it has more properties. So before the fields plugin, and that's even before the Grails 3 scaffolding, we have this is an example of the create form. So we would render a template form and give it a writer, or we would just use the old way of saying grender template form model writer. So that was how we did it in Grails 2 before they started using the fields plugin for scaffolding. So the form GSP is this one, and this is the one that's required for the writer. So we have div class, field contain, div class, field contain. It's gonna like repeat yourself a lot, really, a lot. So, and we just even to get everything on the screen, we have to scroll down. So before the fields plugin, that was a lot of lines of code, and now with the fields plugin, we try to stay dry. So I will do a fairly quick run through of the tags that are available in the fields plugin and how we interact with them. The first part is the widget, which wraps the input itself, so a text field, text area, date picker, select, drop down, checkbox, radio buttons, all those kinds of, that's what we refer to as widgets. And then there's the field itself that has a wrapper that wraps the widget. And then to make it a little bit easier, we don't know what the width do on if we have a bean in Ruby, we can write the bean name and then dot width, and then we can start in a closure acting on the properties. Width here does exactly the same, so we don't have to repeat the bean for every field. We can just once write fWidth bean equals and then the bean name, and then inside the body of the width field, we can start writing fields just with the property name, which again saves code. And the fAll is just let the field plugin output all input elements from a domain class. It doesn't work on other beans, it only works on domain classes because there are some features in Grails that allow you to introspect what the persistent properties are available on a domain class. So that is that was the input side of it. Then we have the display side of it. We have a display widget, which just determines how to render the value. So for most of them, like string, will just be the string. So we don't even define an input, an output display widget for strings. We just use the default because it will just output the default. But for date, it could be a format date, or for an enum that implements message sort resolvable, it could be a gmessage equals and then, or a gmessage, so it will render the right output. So there are various ways that we can define that, and then of course the display widget is wrapped in a display wrapper rendered by the display. So we often don't use display widget directly, but we can. Most of the time we just use display because that will also provide the wrapper around the HTML wrapping around the widget, display widget. And then finally, for Grails 3, we needed something to display a table. And actually, display also displays a bean. We'll render all the properties on a bean. So we have an easy way to create a show view for scaffolding. So let's start with the widget itself. So this renders a widget for a bean property. So by default, we provide it with a bean and a property name. And then the fields plugin will dive into a list of potential path where it can find a template. And if it doesn't find a template, it will render a default one. That's what I just said. So let's try and look at an example. So we have the bean writer and property name, and we have the constraint nullable equals false. So what that is equivalent to is rendering gText field name and a value what is in the writer bean name property, and set the required on the HTML. And that will, in the end, result in this HTML output. So that will, in HTML5, make sure that if you try to submit your form without that field filled out, the HTML will not even allow you to submit, so it won't even do a round trip to the server. So now we have the writer bean again, but this time the age, and remember the age was an integer, and it's also nullable. So this time it's equivalent of rendering gfield type number and then set a min value to 0. I forgot to get that in the constraints, but there's also a min value constraint equals 0. So we cannot have an age younger than the 0 years, which makes most sense. And that will output this HTML. So now we get into a case where we have a speciality. So he can be a climber, a puncturer, a sprinter, or an all-rounder. So this is equivalent of rendering the speciality with the value from the writer, and then a little trick that you can actually access the constraint properties on the speciality and get the in list, so it will render the right list when it renders the output for HTML that looks like this. So again, it's nothing really special in here. Then I have the notes on the writer. Again, it should have been a text area, but the default field that the field plugin renders is a text field for strings. It doesn't know about all the constraints that you can add. So we would get this output text. It's not going to look very nice if you have a long text. So it can be solved, and we can solve it simply by, in the constraints, add a non-constraint, but add something called the widget constraint and tell it what widget to render. And that will actually solve our problem with getting the right output. So now we get a text area, and we get a text area in the HTML.
Can we define the size, columns, and rows as well?
Yes, then you would go and define the field itself. This is all just how it does it default without ever defining any templates ourselves. So this is just telling the fields. If you look in the source code of the fields plugin, you can find all the goodies. That's how I sometimes. Not everything is documented, so some of the things that's not documented. No, but I found that in by looking in the code, because the code is actually fairly easy to read. Robert did a very good job in that.
Do you think that might be deprecated?
No, I think it'd rather be documented at some point.
I'm worried about disappearing.
Yes. So now we go to the field. This one's the one that wraps the widget, and it does that by looking for a wrapper template in this long list of potential path. I'll go back to that. And if it doesn't, it will wrap it, again based on type and name and constraints. And we'll just take a few examples of, again, this time it wraps, and one of the things that it does is, that one is null equals true, so it just renders the weight, and then it uses the IATM. So you can see actually it has writer.weight.label. So that's the bean name and the property name and .label. So it's very easy to make internationalization or changes to your property. The property name doesn't have to follow what you want in the UI, but the UI will be consistent, which is very nice. And then it's equivalent to rendering the F widget in here, but that's not 100% what it does. And of course we get, so if we do it for a required, we'll get an extra span that says we have a required indicator. So we'll get a star to tell the user that this one has to be, required. So this will be the render output. We can also, with the field, make our own body. We don't have to rely on the body that the widget renders by default. So that will simply be inserting whatever HTML or GSP tags that we wish here, and we'll get the same output as we would have if we let the field plugin decide itself. So we are drying things up right now because that was what we had before, and that's what we have now. If we say this is the equivalent, and that was how it would look like if we did our select box. It's still fairly dry, because here it's easy to see what is different from the standard. We don't drown in markup. So then we have the width, and it simply provides us with a way of saying we have the bean. Oh, it's personal. I forgot to change that. But nonetheless, the only thing we change is we move the bean definition from the field here to up here, and then whatever the field, it will look at the page scope to see if it has a bean definition. If it does, it doesn't complain. But if it doesn't, it will say, well, a field tag requires a bean and a property. Then we have the FAll. That will simply interrogate the bean that is about to render. But it only, as I said, it only works on domain classes because it can do a query to persistent properties, and that's what it uses to render a field for each property. And you can add a few. You can add an exclude to it, so you can exclude some of the properties that you don't want shown in that list, or you can change the order by providing a list of properties in the order you want it. So it's fairly configurable. So again, we can say the writer. We can writer order and accept notes.
This is the one I want to always use, but
Oh, okay. So you excluded it. and then render the text area as a
Yeah, or avoid using entirely.
yeah.
Would that all do with ID inversion?
It wouldn't what?
ID inversion from your name
No.
models?
Those are for some reason not considered persistent properties. So this is how it's actually used in create GSP when you create the output. I just simplified and removed some of the excess. But in the field we have an FOB writer. So that's the easy way to look at the scaffold. That's the scaffolding template right now. Then we have the display widget. It's more or less the same story. This will look for a display widget for a given property, and if it doesn't find it, it will be a little bit intelligent. It will just use the field value. Unless it's a Boolean, then it will use the format Boolean, or if it's a date, it will use format date. So it's not just a two-string always. There's actually a little bit of cleverness. And the good thing about format date is that you can, in your message bundle, actually provide a default formatting for format date. So it doesn't have to be, you don't have to rely on the one that is provided by Grails. You can provide your own. So that would be one way of formatting dates. It's called I think it'll be easiest just to quickly go into the tags and look at format date, and maybe not. Yeah, it does. It says here it looks up format from the default message source reset bundle with the key, with this key. If format and format names are empty, format is looking at the default date format key. So if you use that, you don't have to, and you can format that, which is pretty smart. And probably the same thing is available for format Boolean. Is my guess. So we normally use display widget together with fDisplay, but there could be times that you just need to display a field value in another context, in a text where you want to format it, but you want to make sure that it's formatted the same way as it is everywhere else. And that's kind of the key of the fields plugin, that values will be formatted the same no matter where they appear in your application. So now we have the fDisplay. And again, it will wrap the display widget by looking for a display wrapper. And if it doesn't find it, it will do it with a default one that is built into the plugin. So if we have this writer me, I'm not writing a byte, but it could be me. This will be the default output. And how it will look if I was to write it in regular GSP, and rendered HTML will be something like this. So it becomes a nice way of looking at it. The Grails, the one that designed the Grails UI, decided to use unnumbered lists, bulleted lists, and then LI entries. And then you can use the display for a bean only. Then it will display and have the same syntax as the FR for forms. Yes, exactly. So it tries to render a template called templates_fields_lists, and that's one thing I'm suggesting that we change it so it goes in the underscore fields. I don't know why they decided to do that detour when they when they start using it for Grails 3. So it is different from other tags because they look in fields and then default and so on. I'll get back to the list of things. So for our writer, that will be, it will actually iterate over the persistent properties and make a list item for each of them. And of course that will end up some HTML I didn't get pasted in here because it's really long. Table is the last one. That's also a new tag for the fields library from Grails 3 because it's needed to render the table. And it renders the table fields, table GSP, and this is also different from the other tags. So there's an example here where that's what it renders. That is actually a copy of the templates. So we can go in and change that. I don't know. That's the short answer. So we're going to look at where do we find the templates and how does it get weaved in. And then we're going to look what parameters are available in our templates. And then we're going to look at how it selects wrappers and widgets. So when it looks up a template, it also always goes from the most fine-grained lookup down to the most generic. So it starts, and it's based on controller name, action name, bean type, bean name, property type, and property name. So it's actually very thorough. I think the usual field when you start the lookup checks for between 18 and 20 folders for each template. So this is an example where I just have action name, controller name, action name, and property type. Then it will look in controller name, action name for a, let's say, widget, controller name, property type, controller name, and then it'll start looking at the fields, at the class name, at the property name, superclass name, the property name, and the association type, so has many, has one, the property type, and the property superclass, and finally it looks in default. So you can see it actually goes through quite a lot of folders each time to try and find the most fine-grained version of a field to render, and that it does this for the widget and the wrapper every time for every field. And for that reason, you can turn on and off your caching of caching of your templates in your config. So it's only when you develop your templates you should turn off caching, because otherwise you'll pull your hair, because it takes a little bit of time for it to render a form with form fields if it's not cached. So you'll notice that the first time you get into a form that you haven't been in before, it can actually take a second to render the form, but then subsequent renders will be fast if you have turned on caching. It's turned on by default, so it's also good to remember that when you develop your templates to turn it off. Otherwise, you'll have to restart your server every time, and then it takes even longer. So a very quick example, I'm just not going to mention them all, but if you look at writer and name, then it will look for these fields. Oops. So it will look for create name wrapper, writer, create string wrapper, and so on and so forth. And this is probably, yeah, it's just a widget. So same thing. And what parameters do we have available when we render these templates? because now we're getting to the metal of it. We want to write our own templates. So it's kind of important to know what variables in our template we actually have available to us. So we have the B name, the property, the value. That's kind of a given, right? If we didn't have those, it would be kind of hard to render an input field. We also have the label, and that's actually the label that's already been run through the message bundle. So it will either create whatever translation it finds in your internationalization messages bundle, or it will create a nice looking extract of the label. So if you have a camel cased property, it will nicely split the camel case apart and capitalize, lowercase and capitalize the first letter of each part of the camel case. So it will look fairly nice in a UI if you name your variables nice. It will also give you access to the type, so that's a class, and it will tell you if the field is required, so you don't have to look up in the constraints itself yourself. You can just look at the required. But it does also give you access to the constraints directly. And for domain classes, you have access to the persistent properties, or the persistent property. So that actually means that if you save and you get your bean back at a validation error, in your persistent property, you will find your original value, as far as I remember. Because that's the value that was retrieved from the database, that when you try to save it and you have a validation error, the object that you get back actually contains the value you tried to save. But it could be nice that you could go and see what was the persistent value if you want to help the user for some reason.
Doesn't value, field value bring in the persistent value?
No, the value itself is just the value extracted from the database or from the object.
There is a tag field value, and if you're using this tag to render the value of a property,
could be. I'm not.
If you look at the persistent property,
Is there an option for that?
or no, you will not get the persistent. You will get the one that you enter.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So this actually could be used as an enhancement to create your UI because you have access to the persistent value. There's a few more. You can ask if it's invalid. You can ask what errors are on this specific field, so you don't have to yourself extract from the beans errors value. You can just look at the errors on that's passed in, because that's only the validation errors for your. And the prefix I've actually never used, so I'm not sure what that's used for. And then finally, when you render the field and display wrapper, you get the widget rendered out for you. So that's already an HTML string containing what the widget would look like. So you can insert that into your code, or it's the evaluated body. So depending on if you have a body inside your field or display, or you're just trying to render the property. Very short word on the I18N. Anybody knows why it's named that? Yes. It's kind of weird, but it works. So again, if you, as I said earlier, when you translate this, it has a get code, B name, uncapitalized. There's not really methods called that, but and then get property name dot label, and the default is actually a Grails util class, so that has a get natural name. So if you want to use that, you can in your code. That's so date of birth will become date of birth if you look at the default value. So then you could in your message just provide writer born label is date of birth, or in the Spanish translation, however that's pronounced, or in the Danish translation, fødselsdag. Huh? What? Fødselsdag. Exactly. So now it's time for me to sit down, but actually before that, I'm just going to grab a glass of water. Yeah, well, Danish and Swedish share 60 to 70% similarity, and Danish Norwegian is 80 to 90% similarity. So you can understand a Swede if he speaks slowly, and it's easier to understand one from Norway. So let's switch to the IDE, and I'm trying to live code some of it, but I'm also gonna sometimes just reset my my project to a certain point in the GitHub repo to make sure that everything is consistent with what I'm trying to say. And also, from experience, it's sometimes takes too long to write the code actually yourself. So I'll bring in some code, we'll discuss that part of the code, and then move on to the next part. The project, as I said earlier, is 2 domain classes, a team. We're not gonna really look at that because oh yeah, I forgot about that. Let me just size that out a little bit. Like that. Name, description, and has many writers, and so the writer is more interesting because the writer has various types of input fields, strings, integers, dates. String is a speciality, so when we look at the constraints, I've tried to make the constraints vary a little bit, so we have an idea of how the fields plugin work. So, and as I said, pre-fields plugin, I rendered out the views for writer and team. So the team is just, I'm wondering why I thought I reset this. Let me just try that again. Oh, it's because I didn't hard reset it. Okay. Let's clean up here. I would have thought that it would have reset my okay, quick way. Here we go. Now we only have the writer, as I would have expected, and I showed in my slides before. I created the view like it would have been pre-Grails 3, So we have a field contain required, blah, blah, blah. It's become very tedious to work with. And while we discuss this, and then in the create, I have rendered the form here. So pretty basic, right? Nothing surprising or new. So we're gonna try and get rid of this, and the first thing we're gonna do is we just gotta continue using the form, but we will try and render it with the fields plugin instead. So let's go to the form and erase it. So the basic way of doing this would be write f fields, and then actually the bean. It looks I think it looks nice with the bean first. Bean equals to writer, and property equals to name, and we can continue down the line here. Team, form, image, weight, speciality, and notes. And this one just creates some data from my Bootstrap, so I have something to look at. So we get in here and we can look at the writer. And I'm going to get back to how it renders the template for the table. So we're just going to skip right into editing the first writer. And it looks like this. And that's the default Grails way of rendering. It's not super pretty, but it works. This is a number field. We can see that because it has these very two small up and down. This one becomes a drop down, and it has an empty value because it's nullable equals true. Notes should be a text area, right? But it's not. And the team is just a picker where it uses the toString on the team bean. And if we quickly look at the HTML, we can see that it has in the value, it has, whoops, that went fast. The option has a value of the ID in the table. So pretty straightforward, right? So we could fix the first problem with the widget. So let's just see if that will work. Might need a restart. If we require a restart, I'm just going to add it. Widget equals to text area, and then maybe the compilation will work and we'll have everything. Otherwise it might drop my database and I'll have to restart. So let's see what happens here. Oh, it actually worked. That was nice of it. That's probably because the schema didn't change. It was only the constraints that changed. So now we actually get a text area instead, as we would have liked to have. Handle the too many. I'll get back to that. Yeah, we can write our own template for that. I have that a little further down my list. But this is not Bootstrap. Well, it is Bootstrap, but it's not Bootstrap in the way that the forms are default in Bootstrap. So It's a mix of Bootstrap and Grails' own CSS. So we can make it look more like Bootstrap. I don't know if you're familiar with Bootstrap. But if we go to forms, and let's just do one more time forms. Come on. There. We have forms that looks like where you have the label and then the input field that spans across the page. So that's one way of having forms, and in this case that's what I will be aiming at. So I will be aiming at a form element will be wrapped in a form group. It will have a label, and it will have a input field that has the class form control. That's what required to make it look like this. So the class form group forms the group, and labels inside that are bolded, and then the input field has the only thing I don't have a placeholder, but we could probably make that work as well, because we have the label available, right? So let's try and see if we can do that. I'm just going to simply copy this. I'm not sure I got that copy. And so let's go in and create a new folder here. Over here. New directory. It has to be called fields, and it has to have a default folder. So that's like that. Yeah, in the views folder, yes. So over here we have the views folder. That's where I'm making a new folder. And if I beef this up a little, it's easy to see. Like that. Now we have the default, and then we can go and make a new file, and we will call that the wrapper GSP. That's empty now. So a good guess if we reload our page is that we get absolutely, maybe absolutely nothing. Did I spell it wrong? Yeah, that's why. Thank you, pair programming. Let's try it again. And actually, yes, nothing is rendered because it renders my wrapper, and the wrapper is empty. So, but if we add this, then we can start looking at what can we do. Well, the label for is the field, and the label itself, the text for the label, we have that available as label. The input type, well, right now the input is actually something that's not rendered by us. It's just rendered by the widget. So we'll just say, please render our widget. Like that. Because the field rendering provides the widget for us in the wrapper. So when we go back here, we can see that we have something that looks similar to what we had before, or something is missing. The input fields are not formatted right, and that's because the Twitter Bootstrap requires us to add a class to each input element called form control, and we're going to do that next. So we're going to add a default wrapper. Oh yeah, sorry, I keep forgetting. Like that. So let's make a new file and call it widget.jsp. So the widget will be our G text field, name equals to the field. Just going to make sure that I got it fairly right here. Excuse me? In the default, it will look, that will be the final destination if it doesn't find anything else. No, but that's because, well, that could be our final destination. Actually, I recommend that you don't make a default widget and let the fields plugin decide if it can't find anything else, it will render the default widget. But for now, for example, I'll make a widget here and I'll make it a text field, which is probably not a good choice. So the name and a value and a class of form control, and that's pretty much it. So we have that. Let's go back to our field. What did I write wrong? Text field, there's required name. Oh, it's because it's called property, not field. So here it's probably called property as well, like that. Okay, so 2 steps forward or 1 step forward and 2 steps back, right? Because now everything is a text field, even though weight should be a number and speciality should be a drop down and note should be a text area. That's not good in general. So let's iterate over this. So strings, let's handle strings first. So we make a new folder for directory string, and we move our widget to the string folder. Okay, let's go back and say, okay, well, better. Now we've reduced the number of arrows that we have on our form. There's still weight, it's not looking right. Puncture is still a string. It should be a drop down. So let's see what we can do for that. And also, one thing that's missing is the required indicator. And if we go to our create page, there will be no validation on the client. Everything will go to the server. Maybe not what we want. Maybe it is what we want, but let's look a little bit more at the wrapper, because there's more things we can do to it to make it be a little nicer. One of the things is the validation. It would be nice that if we had the red field if the field has an error.
Why do you write a new widget template? Why don't you just surround the widget tag there with span and put the label in this class, CSS class form?
Well, I want to. It's kind of a separation of concerns. The wrapper should only be focused on what the wrapper should do, and the widget should only be focused on what the widget renders. Get my point?
You want to wrap the widget, so it's a good place to put the wrapping stuff in the wrapper.
Yeah, I'm gonna add more of the. You mean for the validation?
No, because you put in a widget, GSP.
Yeah.
All the widgets are rendered the same regardless of the kind.
No, that's exactly the point. The widgets are rendered according to the type.
Yeah, but
I only have this is the widget, and this is the wrapper.
yeah, but the widget you have put in text field. So
Yes, now that's because it's a string now. So I put it in the string folder, so now it doesn't have a default render for things that are not a string. That's why I get mixed. Some of them look right, and some of them do not look right because this one is rendered by the Fields plugin's default way of doing it. This one is rendered the way I wanted it to be rendered. So it's a mix and match, and the further we get down the demo, the closer we'll get to something that we like. So building the first set of templates, widgets, and wrappers is a little bit of work, but when the cool thing is that when you're done, you're done. And you basically don't have to go back and do it again. Yes. Yes. So right now it renders by the string widget. It doesn't know about the in list. So let's see what we can do about this. We have the text field, we have the wrapper. We want to make sure that the wrapper represent arrows. So we can go up here and say, well, if we have an invalid field, then we add another class to the field, otherwise we do nothing. So that means when we resubmit our form here, we now get a red box around that. I think it's red. I'm red-green colorblind, so I assume it's red. It's darker. Okay. And we can actually go a step further, and we can go and say, well, we also want, if we have an error, we actually want the error represented under the text field. So that's also possible. Let's add that. So we test if we have errors. And if we do, we iterate over them. Error, and then we span class help block. And we use the G message to, it has an option to pass in an error. And that's pretty much it. Of course, at some point we would have to render, we have to change our template that renders the whole view, because now the errors will pop up both at the top and below the field. But that's kind of a detail. But right now we'll actually get error messages for our fields under the field. And that's consistent throughout our application. Again, I think that's a cool feature. So actually for speciality, we could also see that it will complain because it's not in the list. So we get that it's not in the list. That's a nice side effect for that. So we got the string widget. So let's start from the not from the top, because it's not in the order that I thought it would be. Let's look at weight. That's a number, right? So we can go in and say, well, what's the type? We can make a field for the type. Make a directory for the type. Directory number. And let's just, for quickness sake, make a copy of the widget. That's a string. There we have the field, and then it requires you to tell the type, so it's a number. And let's just leave it at that, but we'll see that now we continue with the weight, that it looks nice. go back to the one that has content. So that was the number. Not very difficult. We're still lacking the what happens if the field is empty. Localhost writer create. If we have that, we still lack the HTML for that. And we could go in and say, okay, for the string widget, we could just say required equals to, and we had a boolean that said required. Anybody got a feeling about this? Okay, good. I'm just going to submit twice here. Maybe. So if I do this. Please fill out this field. But that's not a required field. And what goes wrong? Anybody has an idea? Yes, again, if we quickly look at HTML here and see here, we can see that it says required equals false. But the HTML spec says if it says required equals any value, it's a required field. So I am actually working on a pull request for Grails to treat required as one of the Boolean fields that if it's false, it will not even be rendered in the HTML. But it will be a configurable value because right now there are 3 of them that it's disabled. 2 more, I don't remember them. But there are 3 of them that are already there that are treated as Boolean. So if you in Grails in a tag use a true or false, it will render them as required or disabled equals disabled if it's true, and it will not even be there if it's false. So I'm going to add that as a configurable option. I realized that when I was doing my prep for this talk that this is not working. So that's what happens when you do demos. So actually, for now, we only have one option. And that is duplicate this line and wrap it as in a G if test required. We do this and G else we do this. And we would have to do the same for number, right? So it's not super nice looking, but on the other hand, it's only one change in 1 or 2 or 3 files, so it's manageable. It's not like it's the end of the world. Okay, so the next one. Oh my! I said okay. I shouldn't have. The next field is the text area. And one thing I think we should look at right now is how could we actually go about determining what field are looked up. So right now we're in run mode. I'm just going to restart my application in debug because I will show you where you can put a breakpoint to actually start looking at what the code does behind the scenes. So you can use that as a hint to where to place your templates. So the class we're looking for is form fields tag library template service. There it is, that one. And by coincidence, somebody already placed a breakpoint there in line 75. So that's where it looks up the candidate template's path. So it has a get template name cacheable. That's just a way of either using it as a close, even use it as a memorized or non-memorized. So it will just use an in-memory version of a kind of a cache. So it's simply to save rendering time when we go into production. It could probably be backed by a real cache instead, but I think they decided that the memory footprint of templates would probably not be that big. So it's running again, and let's just set a regular breakpoint that's not disabled, and let's just run it and see what happens when the code hopefully breaks there. Stops there. There we go. And we do one step further forward. And now we can look at the candidate's path for, in this case, property accesses says that it's a, let me see the zoom here, bean time, property name is name. That's the first property of the list, so obviously that must be the one. So, and let's go up and look at the candidate's paths here. So you can see that it starts by looking in the folder in the views for the writer and for the save action and for the name property and the widget. And then it continues down the list, and then it ends up in the fields plugin. Again, you can define the writer here. So it's very fine-grained. So you can either define it for the action and the property, or you can define it for the property alone. So if you have a special case in a special action where it needs to be rendered differently, you can just go in and define it. And then it continues, and it actually takes a detour because Grails now implements being a domain class as a trait. So it has all these trait classes as lookups as well. So they could probably eventually be filtered out because that probably doesn't make much sense using those, but you can. So you can see you get the trait field helper here as well. So, and finally we get down to string and char sequence. So that's for this field an exhausted list of lookup paths. So that was just to give you an idea of where you could look for help if you're wondering why it's not rendering the right place. You know, I'll just leave the point for you there so you can take the picture. So let's let that continue. Which one were we looking at? We were looking at weight. No, we were looking at, let's just look at speciality as the next one. So let's make a conditional breakpoint where we say the property accessor property name equals speciality. Then we don't have to stop for every breakpoint. We only for every property we just have to stop for the one that we're interested in. So again, it will render, and this time it will hopefully only stop for that property. Making conditional breakpoints in IntelliJ does considerably slow down execution time because it has to evaluate more things during runtime. So, but we have the specialty widget here, and we are interested in the part that is down here. And actually we can see that we don't have a specific type that we can look for. The best we can do is still string. So in the case for dropdowns, my suggestion is either make one that's specific for the type that you're working with, or use the constraint widget and say this is select. I know it's not pretty to mix view logic with the domain logic, but on the other hand, it's not like it's the end of the world. But there is no hint in here that says. One thing you could do is in your string make another branch that says if constraints in list, then it must be a select. It does that. It does that. It looks at the constraints. Excuse me? Yes, I believe that form fields tag library Ruby there. Again, I'm a sucker for source code. Whenever I have something that puzzles me, I always look into source code because it tells you the whole story. Field here. Then it gets a template. If it's a template, it will render the template. It finds a template. If it doesn't find a template, it will render the default field. And so the default field says we of course need the widgets. So because it's not input. So we get the render widget here. The render widget looks up a template. It doesn't find a template. Render default input. And the default input looks at various things like the model is in type string or null. Render string input. If it has a boolean, render a checkbox. Let's see what we can find here. Render string input because it must be there because it is a string. And then it looks at, does it has an in list? So we could make, in our field, could we make a branch for that? One thing that we could consider is also make a pull request for the field plugin that will actually make another lookup path for widgets that is an in list or select if it has an in list. And it also looks at if it has a required. So and if the model has a required, it does not have a required. It will add a no selection to the attributes, and then it will use the default Grails renderer for selects with the attributes that has been built up during the processing of the field. So this does give away a lot of hints on how it's doing things. So in my opinion, it's a good place to look for ideas on how to do it. Yes. So if we had to do it, as I said, I think we have two options, and I'm going with the second option, that is simply defining a comma and widget select, and that will allow me to over here make a new directory, call it select, and let's just, for the quickness of it, copy the string widget again, and then enhance the size of this. Is this big enough? Select, name, value is okay. From and that would be the constraints in list. That's where we get the value from. Class form, and the select doesn't have a notion of required, but it has in the second line here the attribute no selection and probably a null and an empty value like that. It could also be two empty values. You're right. Like that. And hopefully, if the demo gods likes me, huh? Am I in a breakpoint? Might be. Yeah, you're right. Sure. It didn't. So what did I do wrong? Maybe I need to restart my server. Might be. When do we have to be done here? You remember? 12:30? 12:15. Yeah.
What do you do if you want to pass in additional values to a widget or to a wrapper that is not taken care of by the plugin?
Yes. So if you have a f and you want to pass in a value to the widget from the fields, you would add widget dash and then the attribute name you want to pass into the widget, and it will strip off the widget part. Let me show you in a GSP file. So let's just look at the create, or we have this form thing here. So if I want to pass something into the widget, a thing that's not available directly from the fields plugin, I could write widget dash my attribute equals some attribute. That will actually allow you to pass in a value that ends up in the widget. But when you get into the widget, it will only be this part. So that's actually a nice way of, and if you just write my attribute, it will be available in the wrapper. So now the value is available in the wrapper. This means that you could actually, you could cheat a little bit. You could actually write widget dash property equals image. And it will actually render the image in the wrapper, but it doesn't really make sense, right? So, but the label would be notes, but the widget would be image, because you override the problem. I'm pretty sure that'll work. I haven't tried it, but.
So that would be possible to maybe when you know it's a string, but you want to render it as a select.
Yes, you could also you can write widget directly and write select here, and then it will render the select widget as well. So, but typical in at least in some cases, that also means that you can go in and say, well, I want to use let me just, since we're running out of time, I'm gonna move forward with my and reset, and then I'll go through the rest of the templates that I have. So let's just quickly go here. Reset current branch for here, hard. Then things might disappear on me, but that's okay. Okay, so now I have created a number of other widgets. I have a date widget, a little more advanced, right? But not extensively advanced. But the cool thing is this one uses the date picker from the Bootstrap date picker library, JavaScript library. And all I did was add a few lines of JavaScript. And you can do that by assets:/script. And then you only have to do one thing in your layouts file. In the bottom of that is that you have a, if you add the asset deferred script, it will gather all those asset scripts and place them at the bottom of the file. So it will collect them and render them in one JavaScript block instead of having them spread out through your code. So that's just a small, neat trick. And it's important, otherwise nothing happens. So that was a date widget. I created a select widget, like the one I just described. So that's not much different from what I just did. I created a text area widget. Again, not much different from what you would have expected, right? Text area required and non-required. And then I have for dates, just for an example, I have a display widget, which simply just displays the value as a date and only takes the date part, not the time part, because default it will render date and time. And when we go into specific things in the writer, the image, I created a special display wrapper because, as you might have noticed, the writer image was actually an URL. So now I'm using the value. Let's go to the writer list. This is, I'm pushing the limit here because I didn't restart my server. And we might be at a breakpoint too. Yes. It might be. Let's give it a chance to recover here. Oh, it did work, right? So actually, the renderer for the table also inherits the display widget, and it looks like this, and it's also styled in the Twitter Bootstrap styling mixed with the Grails styling. So it's we could have huh? Yeah. And as you can see, I also have the weight. It says 62 kilograms instead of just 62. So the weight is simply just a display widget that takes in the format in the number, and